This is an HP Victus 15. It's a heavy plastic slab of a machine intended to slot in right at the entry level of the gaming laptop market, so we'll have a few basic expectations. In this video, we'll show every detail of the Victus 15's components and construction as it's bolted together, then take a look at the fully assembled system. Benchmark heavy videos on these are a dime a dozen, so we're just going to focus right in on the hardware itself. Starting inside the top cover, that's the other side of this panel, we're looking at a molded plastic slab with adhesive copper Wi-Fi antennas slapped into the top left and right corners. A flat ribbon cable adheres to the inside leading up to the webcam, which clips in right at the top. That camera is a very basic 720p unit with stereo microphones mounted by each side. In the bottom left and right corners are two glued-on cast alloy screw brackets containing screw bosses for the hinge, each taking 4 screws. Supplementing these are 2 pairs of smaller screw bosses molded directly into the lid itself. Glued-on load-bearing brackets like this can and do break off, and load-bearing screws should never be sunk directly into plastic. Next up are our hinges. These are each comprised of 4 large complex brackets, 2 on each side, joined by the moving friction hinge in the middle, and attached to them are 2 long skinny outriggers that reach up the height of the lid to reinforce things a little. The main brackets at both ends extend a surprisingly long distance from the pivot point in every direction, and even just from eyeballing the basic shape of these, we can assume they'll most likely end up acting like a giant spring, especially that long thin section that reaches down into the base of the machine. That's right, we've already found the source of the infamous Victus display wobble, and wobble it does. Attached directly to the lid by 2 strips of replaceable adhesive is the LCD display. The 15.6-inch IPS-like panel that HP seemed to have sourced from the lowest bidder has a 144Hz refresh rate going for it and not much else. Color gamut coverage is a wildly unacceptable 62% of the basic sRGB standard. Maximum brightness drops to well under 300 nits after calibrating out a very strong green cast, and while the contrast ratio is decent enough, that's completely counteracted by awful viewing angles that cause blacks to start glowing yellow from even slightly off center. That glow goes absolutely wild if any pressure is applied to the lid. If you were looking for a simple reason not to buy this laptop, this is a good one. The display is surrounded by a basic plastic bezel assembly attached by a combination of double-sided tape and plastic clips around the perimeter. This design is a common source of creaking, squelching, or crackling noises when you open or adjust the lid. But if you're unlucky, those sounds could just be your hinges failing. And on Victus 15, hinge failures aren't uncommon. This isn't proving to be a solid design over time, even by the low standards of plastic laptops. To attach that completed display assembly to the body, which in this case is the underside of the keyboard deck, that's this panel from behind, screw standoffs are sunk directly into plastic on either side, with our lower hinge brackets reaching a long way down into the body to bolt in with only 4 little screws, all far too close together. For strength and durability, we like to see these screws spread out over a much larger area, spanning at least 1.5 inches inward in plastic-bodied laptops to reduce fatigue, so this all looks a bit disappointing. The underside of the keyboard deck looks fairly normal. Trackpad at the bottom, keyboard backed up by a metal reinforcement plate at the top. Up close though, things get a little weird here. HP have somehow ended up concocting a 4-layer plastic and metal sandwich for the upper half of the keyboard deck, where we'd normally expect to see just 2 layers. It's one of a few parts of this machine that contain far more individual components than necessary, and this sort of complex design adds size, cost, and weight to the finished product. The top of the deck, including part of the hinges, is covered with a plastic insert for the cooling vents, half open and half closed. On top of that insert goes another insert, and on top of the insert on the insert is a screw standoff. Can you guess what it's for? That's right, it's for attaching another screw standoff. The replaceable DC in jack, combined headphone microphone jack, and a USB port slot in on the right, and a stick-on non-conductive shield provides a safe environment for the good-looking blue motherboard. This is where all the fun stuff lives, so let's focus on it for a moment. Clockwise from the top left, we've got the 4 ports that will be located on the right-hand side of the assembled machine: USB-C, Ethernet, USB Type-A, and HDMI 2.1. These are permanently soldered to the mainboard, which is always disappointing since busted ports are an extremely common issue on laptops. Next we have our CPU. Fed by a 4+2 phase power supply, this is Intel's Core i5-13420H, an aging and rather mundane Raptor Lake-based chip built on the ancient and creatively named Intel 7 process, with 4 performance cores, 4 E-cores, and 12 megabytes of cache. This CPU has a theoretical maximum turbo frequency of 4.6 GHz on the P-cores and theoretical maximum turbo power of 115 watts. Just to the right of the CPU is the tiny little baby NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4050 laptop GPU, based on the AD107 GPU die and built on TSMC's 5nm process. Fed by an anemic 4-phase power supply, this GPU is backed up by a barely adequate 6GB of Samsung GDDR6 VRAM on an extremely narrow 96-bit bus, which gives a relatively low bandwidth of 192GB per second. Below these are two 2280 NVMe SSD mounts, straddled by a pair of DDR4 RAM slots on the left and the slot for our Wi-Fi and Bluetooth card on the right. Hiding on the backside of the board, you'll find a Realtek ALC3315 audio crab. That's yet another semi-custom codec that we're unable to find a datasheet for. Back here, you'll also find two glued-on backplates to support the cooling system for the GPU and the CPU. With the board screwed in, it's time to mount that cooler, so let's see what we've got. The Victus uses an old-fashioned dual heat pipe design which locates both chips at one end and two fans blowing over a single heat spreader at the other. This unit is almost exactly 30 centimeters long and weighs in at 133 grams. This is less than half the weight you'd see in many other common gaming laptops. Less weight means less thermal mass and less efficient heat transfer, so we're expecting either low power handling or loud fans. More on that later. Cold plates are well finished with very minimal scoring, and the fans are a pair of 45mm radial blowers which only blow directly over the heatsink fins and don't ventilate the case at all. Intake is through two holes directly above the fans, with the remainder of the otherwise massive grille on the D case completely covered. These holes would be extremely easy to block, so be careful using this one on your lap. Mounted to the bottom left and right corners of the case and firing outward on a 45-degree angle are our two speakers, each comprised of one very generic 2.5cm oval paper driver in a small enclosure. Our wireless chip is a Realtek RTL8852BE featuring Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. That's well out of date at this point, but it's easily replaced. The included storage is a Micron 512GB PCIe 4 drive featuring QLC NAND flash and a Phison controller with no DRAM cache. Given that this is clearly a low-cost drive, read and write speeds aren't bad at all and are miles better than the underperforming junk we usually see in these cheaper systems. RAM is a wildly disappointing single 16GB stick of DDR4 3200. That's right, this gaming laptop equipped with an already ropey 13th gen Intel CPU is hobbled by a single channel of slow memory. If you're a millionaire, you can add another 16GB stick for dual channel, which on these DDR4 systems can dramatically improve performance. After installing our 70Wh battery, which is held in by 6 screws and very easily replaced, the plastic D case clips in and screws on, and then the system's ready to rock. Weighing in at about 2 kilograms or 2.5 kilos including the power supply, the Victus 15 is a heavy laptop best suited to stationary use on a desk with the occasional trip to the couch. All of our external ports are tucked up the back, easily accessed but out of the way, and thankfully there's no noisy side vents to cook your mouse hand. The display opens easily with one hand, but you'll immediately notice that wobbly instability. This is constantly annoying, even sitting on a desk, and wildly irritating when you're using Machine on an unstable surface like your lap. With the lid open, you're greeted by a white backlit keyboard with a number pad. Keyboard action is a little disappointing on the Victus 15, especially if you've used its similar looking 16-inch brother, which has a noticeably better keyboard. Here, the keys are just a little too softly sprung, a little too rattly, and a little too unstable. On the other hand, I love the layout of this one, with genuinely full-sized keys on the number pad, delete right above backspace, and a power key that takes significantly more force to activate than its neighbors, making it much harder to press by accident. Nice. Backed by that thick 4-layer sandwich underneath, the palm rest and keyboard deck do manage to stay reasonably stable under normal use, but the entire keyboard squishes inward about 1 millimeter before being braced. The trackpad fitted to this machine is a bit more convincing than the keyboard, and it's actually quite pleasant to use. On the other hand, the design of the integrated button makes it prone to rattling when tapped, so if you use tap to click, this will probably drive you nuts over time. HP's power supply uses a barrel connector and is rated for a maximum of 120 watts. You heard that right, this big heavy gaming laptop ships in this configuration with an alarmingly small power supply. Most Victus 15 variants come with a 180 watt brick, so this model turns out to be a bit of a cheeky bait and switch. And on that note, we've subjected this machine to several full load stress tests over 30 minutes each to see how the power delivery and cooling cope under harsh conditions. We run all tests in a climate controlled room, first at 20 degrees to simulate a typical office environment, and then at 30 degrees to represent a bedroom on a hot day. Data has been gathered using the cross-platform OCCT Pro software suite, which offers extensive integrated stability testing and in its Pro version, data logging capabilities. For all of the following tests, the machine is sitting flat on the desk running running Ubuntu 25.04 with NVIDIA OpenKernel Driver 575 and set to its high performance power mode with NVIDIA Dynamic Boost enabled. Testing is carried out before the machine is dismantled to avoid any changes introduced by repasting the cooler. Loading up just the CPU on its own in an ambient temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, power briefly spikes up to 90 watts, then crashes down to its rated 45 watt TDP, sticking there like glue afterwards. This sees the maximum core temperature initially bounce off a 96 degree maximum before overcorrecting into the 60s and then gradually leveling out at 83 degrees. Under these conditions, the Core i5's performance cores maintain a steady frequency of 3.5 GHz. With the RTX 4050 loaded up again on its own with the CPU at idle, power smashes into a very disappointing 50 watt limit and, well, stays there. Yes, this particular model of this big heavy laptop pointlessly power limits its GPU to just 50 watts. Unsurprisingly, the dual fan cooler is still well within its limits, dissipating 50 watts, so GPU core temperature never exceeds 71 degrees and levels out at just under 69. Nice. That gives us an unremarkable steady-state core clock of 2100 MHz. With both chips loaded up at the same time for a worst-case scenario heat load at the same 20-degree ambient temperature, our Core i5 is throttled to a surprisingly low steady state of only 25 watts. With such dramatically lower power, the sustained core temperature settles at a much lower 78 degrees and our performance core frequencies drop to a rather disappointing 2 GHz. Under the same conditions, our GPU sticks like glue to its 50 watt power limit once again, so from this we can confirm a maximum of 75 watts combined power handling in this system. Our little GPU levels out at 72 degrees in this test, which the GPU boost algorithm finds agreeable enough to give us a sustained core clock of just over 2 GHz. Now, since those tests were carried out at the reasonably low ambient temperature of 20 degrees, you might be wondering how badly this system would cope on a hot day. So we've run the combined load test again at an ambient temperature of 30 degrees, again for the full 30-minute period. Cooking away in a hot office, the CPU now levels out at a slightly higher 79 degrees, indicating the cooler is having no trouble with the increased load. CPU power is unchanged at an average of 25 watts, and our clock frequency is unsurprisingly pegged at the exact same 2 GHz. Nothing to see here then. Our RTX 4050 is once again pegged at its 50 watt TGP, core temperature rises to a slightly higher but still completely reasonable 74 degrees, and as a result, the graphics core clock is yet again happily sailing along at just over 2 GHz. Overall, it's very disappointing that HP have played bait and switch with the Victus 15 by slinging a lower wattage model onto the market without any warning, but this particular variation has absolutely no problems coping with high loads in high ambient temperatures, so we'll call that a clear silver lining. Because the internal layout of the Victus has both of the high wattage chips way over to the right of the case, this machine does a spectacular job of keeping heat away from your fingers while gaming. The palm rest barely moves from room temperature, and the hottest temperature I could find around the WASD keys was a very low 27 degrees, so comfort levels are extremely high on this one. So, can this gaming laptop actually run games? Of course it can. As long as you keep texture details low to free up some video memory, you'll be able to run pretty much any game on a machine like this at lower detail settings. The thing is, between the power-throttled low-performance chips and the terrible display, you won't actually have much fun gaming on this one. I know I didn't. And that brings us quite swiftly to our conclusion. There are positives and negatives here. So, were our expectations met? Well, there's just enough performance and memory in this machine to run PC games, and at a low enough price, the components on offer here aren't too bad, other than the screen. Cooling in the Victus easily keeps up with the low requirements of the low power chips, and surface temperatures are well under control where it matters. The 512GB SSD included here is just enough to squeeze a few games onto, and the keyboard and trackpad are usable. Unfortunately, in this day and age, that dog of an LCD display is nowhere near good enough, even if this was the cheapest gaming laptop on the market, which it sometimes is. Worst of all, there's no way past the fact that the construction of this laptop varies between shabby, fragile, and plain bizarre depending on where you look. You're constantly annoyed by the wobbly display flapping around, and there's now a well-known risk of the hinges self-destructing at any one of the obvious failure points. A low price tag, if you can find one, on a laptop that's going to suck while it works and cost a bomb to repair when it prematurely breaks is a bad deal. And given that you're likely to regret buying this one long after you forget about the money you saved, we're dishing out yet another lowest possible rating of complete crap for the HP Victus 15. Bonus points for the extortionate price HP are asking for the new model.